Hello, welcome back to Book and Page. We are on to the second last chapter of All Quiet on the Western Front, chapter 11. This is not going to be pretty. It was winter when Paul arrived back at the front and second company, but time, death, and philosophy are all just mixing together. And it seems to be springtime now, but the company is actually headed into one of the worst periods of the fighting, which is the summer of 1918. From here on out, it is mainly just death and destruction. Dierting sees a cherry tree in blossom, and the sight actually makes him abandon the front, and he deserts the company and attempts to make it back to Germany on foot. He is picked up by German military police and court-martialed. The implication, of course, is that he is killed following that court-martial for desertion of the German army. Berger has his pelvis blasted to pieces when he attempts to go out to save or put a dog who's been injured out of its misery. And unfortunately, one of the men sent out to collect Berger is also shot in the leg. Muller is shot point blank and dies of a gut wound after half an hour of pain. Soldiers that are not fit for war are being sent back anyways because the doctors recognize they just need people on the front. The Germans now are actually on the defensive. The front itself has broken up into pieces and is a lot of smaller fighting. The British and the Germans have actually, the British and the Americans have actually teamed up against the Germans, and unfortunately the Germans are not doing well. The commander of the second company actually sacrifices himself to take out a pair of soldiers with a flamethrower, and unfortunately is shot badly. In fact, Lear is killed in the same hole during the same battle. But they are not all roasted to death. The commander's sacrifice is worth something. Paul recognizes that with the British and the Americans teamed up, they have far more soldiers than the Germans do, far more airplanes, far more equipment, everything that makes a battle go in their favor. And things are falling to pieces. Finally, towards the end of the chapter, Kat is hit in the leg, and Paul works to get him back to the front line. He's bleeding too much for Paul to leave him alone to find the stretcher bearers, so he carries him with him, insisting the entire time that they'll be able to meet again at some point. Either Kat will come back or they'll find each other after the war. But finally getting back to the safety of his own lines, a doctor actually informs Paul that Kat has died. And Paul discovers that Kat took a piece of shrapnel to the head, and that was enough for him. Which actually leaves Paul alone. All his friends have either been removed due to terrible injuries or have been killed outright. Yes. This is certainly a point we should have expected, considering we're reading a war novel, but it's just piled on top. You kind of expect to be hearing about the loss of this company periodically throughout the text, and you do get that every now and then. Kemmerich at the start, there are some wounded people removed in the middle, Krompt is taken out prior to this point, but to just go through almost like a checklist, it's very hard. But truth be told, that's kind of almost what's happening. We are suddenly hitting a point at the end of the novel where things have just hit critical mass and they've all just run out of control. We are effectively watching a train wreck of a book chapter happen as it's happening. Because what's happening is Paul is so far gone in this war that he can't keep things straight. Everything's getting jumbled together. He's trying to survive, but they've gotten past the point where systematically they can. The system itself is actually breaking down in a lot of ways. So it becomes just this moment where everything just piles up, and it really is almost a checklist. By the end of this chapter, Paul is by himself, so it's almost like he stood there and thought to himself, Dieting, charged for abandonment, likely executed. Lear, shot. Muller, shot. Cat, shrapnel. He's literally going through all of the people that he has been friends with, rapid fire as they die. And this speaks to us in a lot of weird ways. Because one, there is sort of the systematic nature to it of a man's brain just struggling to understand what is happening by throwing bits and pieces together. But he's never able to fully understand all of those things. That's why it's interspersed with moments of talk about the doctor sending soldiers back that aren't fit. Well, none of his friends have been returned to the war except him. So he's not seeing that happening, but it's information that's thrown into his head. Same with this moment talking about too many British and American airplanes and how they're playing off the fact that the Germans are running out of everything. This weird moment of cursing the summer of 1918, all of it is interspersed here in this list of death and destruction, because Paul, as a character and as our point of view character, is just struggling to keep all of this information together and to understand everything that he's watching fall apart. We are seeing the breaking point of not just the war, but of the country, and unfortunately of the people we've been following through this story. Paul has survived up to this point, but every little thing has been utterly stripped away from him, including his ability to tell stories, because you see him desperately trying to do that when it comes to Kat, this desperate moment he's just trying to hold on to anything. But he has nothing else to hold on to for any of the other deaths. He doesn't tell himself a story that Dieting got off from that court-martial. He fully admits that the court-martial isn't going to understand the madness that the front forces on you. He can't tell stories about why Lear died. It didn't help that he was a good mathematician. He's trying to remember his friends, but everything is just falling so much to pieces that he's desperate to hold on to anything. And Kat's the one who survives with him furthest. And he tries desperately to get Kat back to the hospital. We hadn't seen this utter desperation in Paul prior to this point. He and Kat discussed putting a recruit out of his misery who had a very bad wound, much like Kat has a very bad wound here. But that's not something Paul is even contemplating, because he's desperate to hold on to anything. He can't think about the pain that Kat is in separate from the pain that he himself is in. That's why he's so insistent, even when the orderly tells him that Kat is dead. He is so insistent until he finds the little injury that did it. And it precisely is the little injury. It is these small moments of chance that you can't fight against. It's that moment of chance that Paul mentioned back when he avoided a bomb when he went to visit friends in a different dugout. It's not Paul in a shell hole with a Frenchman he can fight. Everything we're seeing at this point is utter loss of control, both physically and mentally. And it is the small things that do people in. In fact, we get the biggest description about Kat's death, because that is the last one in a line that Paul could have moved past if he had somebody with him still. But Kat was the last one there. And the moment Kat is dead, and the moment Paul accepts the death of Kat, he is alone. Death has come, and there is no way for Paul to step beyond it. He doesn't even understand his own body after this point. An orderly asks if he and Kat were related, and he repeats, "No, we're not related. No, we're not related." Because that doesn't matter. Relations of blood don't matter here. They've survived so much, and it's all been taken away. And that's why this chapter is such an absolute mess while still seeming almost systematic. Because to us it is systematic, but to Paul it is an absolute jumble of every friend he has lost. All happening in close proximity in a desperate fight towards the end of the war. None of these men go home in one piece, and most of them never get home. The one friend they bury, Muller, they recognize will not stay underground long. They can't even have a peaceful death in this moment. Chapter 11 is actually the resounding anti-war sentiment about the absolute uselessness of most of these deaths. Yet how utterly human every single one of them is. The commander of the company sacrifices himself to avoid the remainder of his company being burned to death. He recognizes most of them probably won't get very far, but he'll give them that chance. Berger goes to try and help a dog because that is human nature, to help other animals we have bonded with, and even other animals that are strange to us. And Derting is perhaps the most human at all, because he wants to walk away. He wants to return to the life he had and be a farmer, and no one will let him. And the system has failed him so utterly, it is perfectly easy to believe that it would have killed him to keep up this pageantry and propaganda of a united front. Quietness doesn't fall on the Western Front until absolutely everything there is dead. Even when we try and walk away from it. We have one more chapter to go. It is a very short chapter, but I'm going to keep reading, and I hope you do too. See you next time.